Hey everybody, thanks for joining us for our video on recursion in Microsoft Access VBA. A recursive process is a process that needs to call itself some number of times in order to perform whatever task it's been given. My goal for this video is not so much to show you some clever code, but more so to attempt to describe recursion for people who either are not familiar with recursion at all or are vaguely familiar and find themselves needing to write some recursive code. What I want to do is try as best I can to explain how it works and then show some code, and hopefully you'll be able to use that code and adapt it to whatever task or application you have a need for. So here's a generic example of a call stack for a recursive process. At the top here we have some sort of procedural code that's running, and at some point it calls a recursive function. So here we go into our first recursive function. Most recursive functions are going to need to have some sort of test or loop during which it decides if it needs to call itself again. So that's what we have at the very top here. We have some sort of if, and it's deciding that it needs to call itself again. So it calls itself again and again. We go into that same, it's the same function, so we go into the same if statement again. Do I need to call myself again? And we're going to say, for our example here, yes, we need to call ourselves again. At some point, though, it will get down to some base level or some condition where it doesn't need to call itself again, and that particular function call will then execute whatever code it has at the very end and either return its result to the calling function or return control to the calling function. And then this loop may or may, if it's a loop, it may continue on through the loop. If it's just a test, the test may be satisfied and it can then fall down to its final bit of code. This function call can resolve itself and return its result to the previous caller. And again, the same thing can happen again. It can execute its final code and resolve itself and then return the final result to the calling code. And then underneath here, of course, there would be some more procedural calls or procedural code of some sort. So the example I'm using for our recursive process today is that of exploring or traversing a folder structure. What I want to do is write code that I can feed a folder to and then have that code find all of the subfolders beneath it and all the files in all of those subfolders beneath it and do some sort of processing on it. So in general, what we're looking for our recursive process to do is we give it this folder, it then goes over here to the first subfolder it finds in this folder, and then goes down to the first subfolder it finds over here and goes down until it can't find any more subfolders, and then returns control up here, goes to the next subfolder it found here and goes down as far as it can in this path until it can't do anything more down this path, and go all the way back up here and back over here and then all the way down as far as it can down this path, finding all the subfolders and files that it can find, back up over here, and then the same thing here again and then here, and then returning control to whatever process called us. So let's take a quick look at a very simple recursive function. And actually I just called it a function, but it's really a method. This function is not returning anything, but it is going to perform some work, so it's a method. Now what I've got here is just the code that deals with the recursive process. No actual processing code in here. So we are going to call our recursive search method, feeding it a folder. Okay, this is going to be a file system object, folder object. Okay. The first thing it's going to do is going to perform that test we described a moment ago. And in this example, that test is actually a loop. So it's going to take our folder that it was given, FLD, and it's going to loop through all the folders in the subfolders collection. So see, this is where we do the exploration of how many how far down do we go until we've found all the folders. So we give it a folder and it finds all the subfolders, and it's going to loop through each folder in that collection and call itself for each folder. So the function calls itself with this new folder and repeats that all over again. Then it takes, so this folder then becomes the input. It gets the subfolders collection of it and goes to the first folder in that collection, and we continue to do that until it can't find any more folders, and those calls begin to resolve themselves. And as we go back up the call stack, these loops will end themselves, and we will fall down and process the files collection, and these will resolve themselves, and so forth and so on. This might still be a little bit confusing, so I have another slide I'm going to attempt to talk through a little more detail this time through our folder structure. Now, I built a folder structure specifically for this video, but the code will run on any folder structure. And I'd actually encourage you to go to my blog and download the code listing and feed it whatever folder you have on your machine so you can get comfortable with understanding how it works. So on our form, we're going to have a button, and it's going to open up a folder picker dialog, and we're going to ask the user to select the folder that they want to explore. So that is here. The user selects a folder, and they're going to, in our example, we're going to select a temp folder. At that point, we'll call our recursive process, recursive search. The first thing it does, here's function call 1, the first thing it does is gets the subfolders collection of this folder and sets up a loop and starts to process the first folder in that loop and starts to process the first folder in that collection. And when it finds that folder, it calls itself again. And the first thing that second function call does is gets the subfolders collection of this folder. We go into a loop and we process the first folder in that collection. And we process it by calling ourselves again. In this case, there are not going to be any folders or files in that subfolder. So this function call 3 can resolve itself. It's complete, no folders, no files to process. It returns control to the function that called it, which is function call 2. Function call 2 then, when we left it, it was in a loop in this subfolder collection, and it was on the first subfolder. So now it's going to move to the second subfolder in the collection, and it's going to call itself again on that subfolder. In this case, it's not going to find any folders, but it will find a file. We're going to process that file, return control to the function that called it. It's not going to, at this point, this folder loop is complete, and it will then look at the files collection in this folder. And I think in our example, it's going to find one file, and then that function call can resolve itself, and we can return control to function call 1 above it. Now when we left it, it was in a loop of subfolders, right? And it was on the first subfolder. So now it moves to the second subfolder, calls itself. First thing it does here, again, gets the subfolders collection, calls itself on that subfolder, and what it finds is no folders, but it will find a file. Processes the file. That function call 6 can resolve itself. It can return control to function call 5. Function call 5 can return control to function call 1. Function call 1 is in its folder loop. It then moves to the next folder and last folder in the collection. Calls itself in that subfolder, and it doesn't find any folders or files. We return control back to function call 1. It is now finished with its subfolder loop. It then goes on to the bottom code, which was the files collection. Processes those files, and then we return control back to the procedural code that started the whole mess. So let's have a look at our database. I have a folder here. Here's the button that will open up our folder picker dialog. Below it is a text box where we will put the name of the folder that the user selected. And below here is a big text box where our recursive process is going to print, if you will, each folder and file that it finds and processes. So what we should see here when we're done is exactly what our recursive process did in the order it did it. So this is, in my opinion, a great learning tool if you're trying to learn how recursion can work, because you can see results here of exactly what happened and in what order. Let's take a quick look at our code, however. So here's our click event of that command button. Now I have references above here. We go. I have references to the Microsoft Office object library and the scripting runtime. The object library is giving us access to the file dialog box, and the scripting runtime is giving us access to the file system object that we'll be using in our recursive process. So the first bit of our code here sets up our file dialog, or excuse me, our folder picker dialog. We're going to give them a title here, select the folder you'd like to explore. We're not going to let them select more than one folder at a time. If they select something, show equals true, we will take the item that they selected, in this case should be a folder, put it in this string variable, and we'll take this path that they chose and put it on our form. From there, we'll instantiate a file system object in this FSO object. We'll then use FSO get folder to get a reference to the folder the users chose. Put that in this FLD object, and then we would call our recursive search, feeding it the folder the users chose. Below here is our recursive code, and again, it is extraordinarily short. Now, all I'm showing here is the code necessary to do the recursion. The only processing code I have in here is taking the folder that it finds, the folder path, and writing it out to our large text box in the form, and we're putting a carriage control line feed after it so that we have each one on a line by itself. And then the same thing happens in our files collection. We take the path of each file that we find and write it to our text box. So we really have bare minimum code here, just enough code to perform our recursion and to show us what it's doing. So what we have here in the code is the bare minimum to perform the recursion and to show us what it did. The first bit of code here is our for each loop for each folder in the subfolders collection of the folder we were fed. For each of those, we're going to write out the path and then call ourselves on that folder. So this is how we drill down into the folder structure. We keep going down until we can't find any more subfolders in the path we're on. And once we get down there, we'll process all the files we've found in the folder we're in, and all we're doing for processing is putting this path into the text box. And once we get down to here, this function call or this method call resolves itself and returns control to the one above it in the call stack. And we keep going and we keep doing that until we've run out of subfolders and run out of files in the folder we chose. Now this code is very short, and one of the reasons it's short is all we have here is just enough code to perform the recursion. There's no real processing going on here. I pulled this code from an application where my users were dumping XML files into a folder in a folder structure, and I wanted them to point to that structure, and then I wanted to find all the XML files in that structure and process them, open them, pull some data out of them, and load them into a database. So down here, this bit of code was much larger with lots of function calls and method calls and whatnot. So the recursive piece was a lot larger in that application. So hopefully, though, that you can take this as a shell and use it for whatever purposes you have in mind. So let's go over here to our form and let's click our button. I'm going to choose this temp folder and we'll click OK. We should see exactly what our recursive process did and in what order. So here's our temp folder that we chose, right to there. You can see it first looked at the first subfolder it found. It then went into that subfolder and found another subfolder and another subfolder in that same subfolder. And then within this subfolder, it found a file. Then it backed out to this subfolder and found a file there. At that point, that whole loop was complete, and it moved on to the second subfolder in the temp folder. And in that temp folder, it found a second subfolder. And in that subfolder, it found a file. And that method call resolved itself, and it went back up to the third folder in the temp folder. And it didn't find anything in there. So then our folder loop was complete. It then processed all the files that it could find in the temp folder. And that then concluded the first call of our function process, and everything ended. So that's it. That's all I have on recursion. I think that, in my opinion, the code is very short and fairly simple to understand. However, I had difficulty when I first learned recursion of just getting my head wrapped around the idea of a process calling itself and calling itself and calling itself. Once you can get past that, then I think you can pretty much write a recursive process for anything you need to do. So I'll put this code in my blog, and I will put a link to that blog entry in the description down below. Feel free to download that code and import it into a database of your own. You make a form like I have here, and then point it to some folder structure on your machine, and then you can walk through the results here you have in this form and see exactly what it did. And hopefully that can help you understand. If you're still having difficulty, hopefully it can help you understand how recursion works. Thanks for watching. I hope you got something out of this video, and we'll see you next time.